This is your host Salim bin Mohammad Rafi, and here is my YouTube channel Zamir Universal. My first and foremost, and I am sure of millions of people around the globe concerned today, will be the Holocaust number 2 in slow motion, happening for the last 75 years, and the slow death of millions of Palestinian women, children, elderly, injured, people deprived of their homes, their honor, their fields, their land, their oceans, their water, their resources, done by a evil, one of the most hated, cruel, despicable, disgusting, disgraceful species on earth. I am ashamed to even mention their name, that it is the children of those who went through this Holocaust by Adolf Hitler. They are doing worst, 1,000 times worse Holocaust, worse than Holocaust to these people. They came to seek refuge. Palestine is that holy land which has the most famous, the religious center of Islam, and the father of the prophets, Prophet Abraham. Last resting place is in Jerusalem. This city has a very long history with the United Nations Army, just like have dare, as Clinton did in the case of Bosnia, bombed that, and then when the Serbian stopped. Why are you not doing it here? Why double standard? Why you hypocrites? Why are you not afraid of being burnt into the deepest pits of the hell? You have no faith. You think that this group of scrupulous criminal people will just be left to do this thing and the Creator will not take care of them. The man proposes and God disposes. I assure you that this very soon you will see the whole of Israel disappeared from the map of the earth, because the extent, the peak of the cruelty they have subjected the poor women and children. Are they combatants? Are the kids combatants, or the women combatants, or the injured in the hospital combatants? And those people whose oxygen you pull and stop the ventilators and let them die, are those the? So you cowards, you cannot face the people who are armed and they are equal with you. They have air force. They can fight with you with a dog fight and see what good you are. Fight them in the field and see what good you are. Up until even now, you have not been able to make even tiny dent in Hamas, let alone the whole Muslim world, let alone the whole world. Brazil, Ireland, Spain, look at what hatred you have earned from the whole world by insisting and being adamant and being spitting on the face of their. Without invitation, you went there to address the lower and the upper house. That's what you are. Mentally deranged Netanyahu, and that's what you are doing to your. Why would you care for the hostages? You have no sympathy. You talk nonsense about the amputees. You think that's the time for them to get married, go to the college and universities. What you have created? You have created a nation of monsters, and monsters cannot have. They have to be completely eliminated from this planet Earth. And then only there will be peace in this world.
For you, and a privilege to speak on behalf of the State of Palestine. I will address the legality of Israel's prolonged occupation, annexation, and settlement of the occupied Palestinian territory. In so doing, I will identify the elements that determine whether and in what circumstances a belligerent occupation is or becomes unlawful under international law. I will then review the evidence to assess whether those elements are present here. And I will show that based on the applicable law and the well-established and undisputed facts, Israel's 56-year occupation of Palestinian territory is manifestly and gravely unlawful, and that international law requires that it be brought to an end completely and unconditionally. The applicable rule of law is straightforward. As Pictet wrote in 1958, occupation is essentially a temporary situation. This remains the law. In December 2022, the General Assembly, in Resolution 77/126, recognized that the occupation of a territory is to be a temporary de facto situation, whereby the occupying power can neither claim possession nor exert its sovereignty over the territory it occupies. This rule is neatly explained in the written statement of Switzerland. The laws of occupation are built on the idea that occupation is only a temporary situation. They are based on four fundamental principles. One, the occupying power does not acquire sovereignty over the territory it occupies. Two, the occupying power must maintain the status quo ante and must not take any measures which might bring about permanent changes. The law is thus crystal clear. Occupation can only be a temporary state of affairs. A permanent occupation is a legal oxymoron. Mr. President, what makes Israel's ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territory unlawful is precisely its permanent character. And what demonstrates its permanence are, one, Israel's de jure and de facto annexation of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Two, its claims of sovereignty over these areas, which it refers to by their biblical names, Judea and Samaria, and considers integral parts of the state of Israel. Three, its establishment of hundreds of permanent Israeli settlements with over 700,000 Israeli settlers who have been promised by successive Israeli governments that they will never be removed. And four, the multitude of official statements and documents that openly declare Israel's intention to incorporate all of the occupied territory east of the Green Line into the state of Israel as a permanent part of a single Jewish state extending from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. As I will show you, the evidence is overwhelming and leaves no room for serious dispute about Israel's actions or its intentions. As Israel's cabinet secretary wrote in June of last year, quote, Judea and Samaria were not seized from a sovereign state recognized by international law, and the state of Israel has a right to impose its sovereignty over these areas, as they comprise the cradle of history of the Jewish people and are an inseparable part of the land of Israel. As purported legal authority, the cabinet secretary invoked the first book of Maccabees, written in the year 100 BC, chapter 15, verse 33. It is not a foreign land we have taken, nor have we seized the property of foreigners, but only our ancestral heritage, which for a time had been unjustly occupied by our enemies. This was followed in August of last year by a message broadcast on Israel Army Radio by Israel's heritage minister. Sovereignty must be extended within the borders of the West Bank. And the most prudent way to create international recognition that this place is ours. There is no green line. It is a fictitious line that creates a distorted reality and must be erased. In September 2023, Israel's prime minister literally erased the green line in his presentation to the United Nations General Assembly. As you saw earlier, he depicted the state of Israel as extending from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, eliminating not only the green line, but all traces of Palestine. This was no oversight. It was an act of the head of government with all the attribution that it implies. The same message was delivered by Israel's finance minister in Paris 6 months earlier, when he denied the existence of Palestine and declared that Palestinians do not constitute a people. Previously, he said, quote, "We are here to stay. We will make it clear that our national ambition for a Jewish state from the river to the sea is an accomplished fact, a fact not open to discussion or negotiation." This has been Israel's consistent position. Here is the map of Israel produced by its armed forces and published by the government in 2021. One state, Israel, from the river to the sea. There is no green line. There is no Palestine. Instead, Palestine has been replaced by Judea and Samaria, which, according to Israel's highest officials, are now integral parts of the state of Israel. As these official statements and maps demonstrate, Israel makes no secret of its intention to retain permanently the entire area east of the Green Line. Its annexation of occupied Palestinian territory began in 1967 with legislation annexing East Jerusalem, which Israel increased 11-fold in size to incorporate not only the Holy City, but also vast areas of the West Bank surrounding the city. Its defense minister, Moshe Dayan, declared at the time, "The Israel Defense Forces have liberated Jerusalem. We have returned to this most sacred shrine, never to part from it again." In 1990, the Israeli cabinet instructed the foreign minister to notify the Secretary General of the United Nations that Jerusalem is not in any part occupied territory. It is the sovereign capital of Israel. In June 1996, the guidelines of the incoming Israeli government stated, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, is one city, whole and undivided, and will remain forever under Israel's sovereignty. More recently, in assuming office in December 2022, the current prime minister declared that the Jewish people are not occupiers in their own land, nor occupiers in our eternal capital, Jerusalem. As these official statements make clear, Israel's dominion over Jerusalem and the incorporated area of the West Bank is not intended to be temporary. It has been repeatedly proclaimed by Israel's highest authorities to be eternal. In furtherance of this end, more than 230,000 Israeli Jewish settlers, encouraged, subsidized, and protected by the Israeli government and occupation forces, have been installed in East Jerusalem, dramatically altering the demographic composition of the Holy City by creating an Israeli Jewish majority. Israel has been equally clear in declaring its permanence in the West Bank, where more than 465,000 Israeli Jewish settlers have been implanted, with the support of every Israeli government since 1967, in over 270 ever-expanding settlements spread throughout this territory in what can only be described as a vast colonial enterprise. These settlements, whose accelerated growth and distribution on your screens now, are a key instrument of Israel's annexation of the West Bank. This is both their purpose and their effect. As the Secretary General reported to the General Assembly in 2015, occupation is supposed to be temporary because the annexation or acquisition of territory by force is strictly prohibited under international law. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the establishment and maintenance of the settlements amount to a slow but steady annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel has made no secret of the intended permanence of these settlements. In 2010, Prime Minister Netanyahu told Israeli settlers in the West Bank, "Our message is clear. We are planting here. We will stay here. We will build here. This place will be an inseparable part of the state of Israel for eternity." In August 2019, the Prime Minister announced, "The time has come to apply Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and to also arrange the status of all Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. They will be part of the state of Israel." In January 2020, Israel's Defense Minister, Naftali Bennett, declared, "Our objective is that within a short amount of time, we will apply sovereignty to all of Area C, not just the settlements, not just this block or another." This area, which is depicted in red on your screens now, comprises over 61% of the West Bank. The defense minister proclaimed, "I solemnly declare that Area C belongs to Israel." This area includes the Jordan Valley, which is the water reservoir, the breadbasket, and the source of life for the entire West Bank. In December 2022, the guiding principles of the incoming Israeli government declared, "The Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlement of all parts of the land of Israel, the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, and Judea and Samaria." The coalition agreement between the political parties that formed the government included this pledge: the Prime Minister will lead the formulation and promotion of policy in which sovereignty will be applied in Judea and Samaria, while choosing the timing and weighing all the national and international interests of the State of Israel. General Assembly Resolution 77/126 was adopted on 12 December 2022, just as the current Israeli government was assuming office. The resolution pointedly recalled, quote, "the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of land by force, and therefore the illegality of the annexation of any part of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, which constitutes a breach of international law." And the resolution condemned, quote, Israel's annexation of land, whether de facto or through national legislation. Israel has thoroughly disregarded Resolution 77/126, just as it disregarded all prior General Assembly and Security Council resolutions declaring illegal the annexation of any part of the occupied Palestinian territory and the establishment of Israeli settlements there. These include, but are by no means limited to, Security Council Resolution 252 of 1968, declaring Israel's acquisition of territory by military conquest inadmissible. Resolution 476 of 1980, which reaffirmed the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories in 1980, and strongly deplored the refusal of Israel to comply with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Resolution 478 of 1980, which determined that all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel to alter the character and status of the Holy City of Jerusalem, and particularly the basic law in Jerusalem, are null and void and must be rescinded forthwith. Resolution 2334 of 2016, which reaffirmed the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force and condemned all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including, inter alia, the construction and expansion of settlements, transfer of Israeli settlers, confiscation of land, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinian submissions. And at least 28 General Assembly resolutions which expressly condemned Israel's annexation of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Israel has also blatantly disregarded the obligations reflected in the court's 2004 advisory opinion in the wall case. Since then, instead of dismantling the wall, Israel has extended it from a length of 190 kilometers to more than 460 kilometers, encompassing hundreds of additional square kilometers of Palestinian land and incorporating it into the State of Israel. In its advisory opinion, the court expressed concern lest, quote, the construction of the wall and its associated regime create a fait accompli on the ground that could well become permanent, in which case, and notwithstanding the formal characterization of the wall by Israel, it would be tantamount to de facto annexation. And that is precisely what has happened over the past 20 years, not only within the expanded confines of the wall, but all across the West Bank, most of which has now been annexed de facto by Israel. In 2022, the report of the United Nations International Commission of Inquiry concluded Israel treats the occupation as a permanent fixture and has, for all intents and purposes, annexed parts of the West Bank. The International Court of Justice anticipated such a scenario in its 2004 advisory opinion. This has now become the reality. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory reached the same conclusion. The occupation by Israel has been conducted in profound defiance of international law. Its 55-year-old occupation burst through the restraints of temporariness long ago. Israel has progressively engaged in the de jure and de facto annexation of occupied territory. Mr. President, Israel's ongoing annexation of the West Bank accelerated in 2023, with the largest ever expansion of settlements in the territory. 22 new settlements were authorized, and more than 16,000 new housing units were built, funded, or planned by Israeli authorities. As explained by Israel's finance minister, quote, the construction boom in Judea and Samaria and all over our country continues. We will continue to develop the settlements and strengthen the Israeli hold on the territory. In developing its settlements, Israel has invested heavily in the infrastructure needed to supply them with water and electric power, as well as a network of roads and highways to connect them to one another and to Israel itself. These investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars attest to the intended permanent character of the settlements. The roads which Palestinians are forbidden to use and a pervasive system of roadblocks and checkpoints prevent Palestinians, but not Israeli settlers, from moving from place to place in the West Bank. And they isolate Palestinian communities by cutting them off from one another. Israel's settlement expansion has thus both uprooted Palestinians from their homes to make room for new settlements and forced them to live in disconnected and non-contiguous enclaves, which the special rapporteur has called, quote, a fragmented archipelago of 165 disparate patches of land. This achieves the fundamental objective of the occupation: permanent acquisition of the maximum amount of Palestinian territory with the minimum number of Palestinians in it. In furtherance of this objective, and with increasing frequency, armed groups of settlers, supported by Israel's occupation forces and encouraged by government ministers, have violently expelled thousands of peaceful Palestinian civilians from their ancestral villages and lands. A UN fact-finding mission confirmed, quote, the motivation behind this violence and the intimidation against the Palestinians and their properties is to drive the local populations away from their lands and allow the settlements to expand. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported in March 2023, quote, settler violence further intensified, reaching the highest levels ever recorded by the United Nations. In November 2023, the High Commissioner warned that the situation had further deteriorated with, quote, a sharp increase in settler violence and takeover of land across the West Bank. Since 7 October, he continued, nearly 1,000 Palestinians from at least 15 herding communities had been forced from their homes. The Secretary General, in his most recent report, issued on 25 October 2023, expressly linked the expansion of Israeli settlements to the permanent acquisition of Palestinian territory. Successive Israeli governments have consistently advanced and implemented policies of settlement expansion and takeover of Palestinian land. The policies of the current government in this regard are aligned to an unprecedented extent with the goals of the Israeli settler movement to expand long-term control over the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in practice, to further integrate those areas within the territory of the State of Israel. Mr. President, members of the Court, taking account of this evidence, as well as that described in the State of Palestine's 2 written submissions, I turn to the law and how it applies to this occupation. The written statement of Switzerland is once again directly on point. It highlights the distinction between the law of occupation and the legality of a particular occupation. The law of occupation and the legality of occupation are 2 different questions. The law of occupation applies independently of the question of the legality of the occupation. Occupation is a situation subject to international humanitarian law, whereas its legality is covered by the United Nations Charter. In relation to the legality of the occupation under the Charter, Switzerland observes, quote, the United Nations has consistently reaffirmed the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force and condemned Israeli measures aimed at modifying the demographic composition, the character and the status of Jerusalem and the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole. Notably, the construction and extension of settlements, the transfer of Israeli settlements, the confiscation of land, the demolition of homes, and the displacement of Palestinian civilians. In Switzerland's view, quote, the measures taken by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory lead to fundamental changes, particularly demographic changes, that can have a permanent character. In such circumstances, Switzerland expressly invites the court, quote, to rule on the consequences of the permanent character of the measures taken by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory as to the status of the occupation under general international law, in particular, the Charter of the United Nations. Many states agree with this approach. France, too, underscores the temporary character of lawful occupation. This is a requirement that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory plainly fails to meet. As France states, if the restrictions authorized by a regime of occupation were justifiable in the period following the military operations, they are not anymore today. These points have been reiterated by the Security Council and the General Assembly on numerous occasions concerning Israel's obligation to withdraw from the occupied territories. France calls out, in particular, Israel's annexation of occupied territory. Quote, the status of occupying power does not confer any legal title justifying annexation. The passage of time is not sufficient as regards the acquisition of territory by force to render lawful a situation that is gravely unlawful. On Israel's vast network of settlements and hundreds of thousands of settlers in the occupied territory, France states, these permanent establishments are obviously incompatible with the necessarily temporary character of the occupation. 35 of the states and international organizations that submitted written statements addressed to the legality of Israel's occupation. 35 of the states and international organizations have addressed the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. Only 2 of these 35, to which I will come, argued that the occupation is not unlawful. Key excerpts reflecting the views expressed by the overwhelming majority that the occupation is unlawful as a whole and must be brought to an end are collected in Chapter 2 of the State of Palestine's written comments. Here are 3 brief but emblematic examples. The African Union, quote, invites the court to conclude that the prolonged Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories is in itself unlawful. The policies and practices associated with it amount to de facto and de jure annexation of the Palestinian territories, which violates the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force. Brazil observes that, quote, occupation is inherently temporary. This is the basic distinction between occupation and annexation. Brazil here hits the nail right on the head. Unlike occupation, annexation is intended to be permanent, and it makes the occupation itself unlawful. In Brazil's words, Israel's policies and practices render the occupation unlawful as a whole, inasmuch as it would be tantamount to the acquisition of territory by force. Japan, too, emphasizes that the annexation of occupied territory is unlawful, referring to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Quote, as the ICJ clarified in the Wall Advisory Opinion, the illegality of the acquisition of territory by force is a corollary of the prohibition of use of force incorporated in the UN Charter, which Japan calls, quote, the most fundamental rule of the post-war regime for peace, based on the rule of law among nations. The 2 outliers are Fiji and the United States. Of all the states that submitted written statements to the court, only Fiji attempted to defend the occupation as lawful. But even Fiji conceded that Israel has annexed East Jerusalem de jure, and that the application of an occupying power's laws to the occupied territory, which is the case in the West Bank, constitutes an annexation de facto. Nor did Israel itself deny its annexations of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Its abbreviated written statement is mainly an attack on the General Assembly for its alleged bias. It makes no attempt to defend the legality of its occupation under international law. The only state besides Fiji to defend Israel is the United States. This is not surprising. Whatever offenses against international law Israel commits, the United States comes forward to shield it from accountability. Here, the United States attempts to defend Israel, not by arguing that the occupation is lawful, but that it is neither lawful nor unlawful. To reach this conclusion, the United States argues that belligerent occupation is governed exclusively by international humanitarian law and not by the UN Charter or general international law. In its own words, quote, although international humanitarian law imposes obligations on belligerents in their conduct of an occupation, it does not provide for the legal status of an occupation to be lawful or unlawful. Even assuming arguendo that this is a correct reading of international humanitarian law, which we dispute, it does not lead to the conclusion that an occupation cannot be unlawful under international law. What about Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and general international law, including the prohibition on acquisition of territory by force? For the United States, apparently, this peremptory norm does not exist when it comes to Israel's annexation and settlement of the occupied Palestinian territory. Only in such a lawless and UN charterless world could the Israeli occupation be described as not unlawful. Notably, the United States ignores the part of the General Assembly's request that the court determine the legal status of the occupation under the UN Charter, in addition to IHL and other sources of law. And the US fails to mention, let alone respond to, Switzerland's written statement asserting that belligerent occupation is covered both by IHL and by the UN Charter and general international law, and that the legality of the occupation itself is governed by the latter. The United States also ignores the written statements of the many other states, which conclude that the Israeli occupation is unlawful as a whole, precisely because its annexation and settlement of the occupied territory constitutes a permanent acquisition of territory by force in violation of Article 2.4 and general international law. Instead, in a single footnote, the United States responds only to those states which submitted that the Israeli occupation is unlawful under Articles 40 and 41 of the draft Articles on State Responsibility for Internationally Wrongful Conduct. Remarkably, the U.S. contends that neither of those two articles reflect general international law. This is truly stunning. A persistent failure of a state to fulfill an obligation arising under a peremptory norm is not unlawful under general international law as provided in Article 40. The injunction in Article 41 that no state shall recognize as lawful a situation created by a serious breach of a peremptory norm is not part of general international law. Just how far, in disregarding the international legal order, will the United States go to exempt Israel from the consequences of its ongoing violation of peremptory norms? including the prohibition on acquisition of territory by force. Apparently, very far indeed. According to former US President Barack Obama, in the memoir he published in 2020, just about every country in the world considered Israel's continued occupation of the Palestinian territories to be a violation of international law. As a result, our diplomats found themselves in the awkward position of having to defend Israel for actions that we ourselves opposed. This is exactly what the United States is doing, again, in these proceedings. Mr. President, members of the court, the evidence is before you. In the written submissions of the State of Palestine and dozens of other states and international organizations, and in the voluminous materials supplied to you by the Secretary General, and it is indisputable. Under the umbrella of its prolonged military occupation, Israel has been steadily annexing the occupied Palestinian territory, and it continues to do so. Its undisguised objective is the permanent acquisition of this territory and the exercise of sovereignty over it in defiance of the prohibition on acquisition of territory by force. The evidence is not only indisputable, it is of the highest probative value. Investigative reports of authoritative United Nations agencies, reports of the Secretary General, resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly, legislative and administrative acts by the Israeli government, and public statements against interest by the most senior government officials, admitting that Israel's objective is sovereignty over all the territory east of the Green Line and its incorporation into a single Jewish state from the river to the sea. In this case, there is no reason not to take them at their word, because their deeds have been entirely consistent with it. For Israel, as its successive governments have made clear, there is no Palestine. It simply does not exist. In November 2023, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that his government would never agree to a Palestinian state in the occupied territory. He later declared, "I will not compromise on full security control over all the territory west of Jordan, and this is contrary to a Palestinian state." Israel's intransigence was confirmed by its staunchest ally in December 2023, when US President Joe Biden publicly lamented that Israel's leaders, quote, "don't want anything remotely approaching a two-state solution." That is the very solution demanded by the Security Council, the General Assembly, the overwhelming majority of states, and the state of Palestine itself. It is, in fact, the only solution that can lead to lasting peace and security for the Israeli people, as well as the Palestinian people. And it is this very solution that has been frustrated by Israel's defiant insistence on maintaining its dominion over Palestinian territory in perpetuity. This is why the court's advisory opinion is so critical and so urgent. The best, and possibly the last, hope for the two-state solution that is so vital to the needs of both peoples is for the court to declare illegal the main obstacle to that solution, the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine, and for it to pronounce in the clearest possible terms that international law requires that this entire illegal enterprise be terminated completely, unconditionally, and immediately. Mr. President, the law is clear and it demands nothing less. A permanent occupation one that is founded upon annexation and massive settlement of the occupied territory, and which aims to exercise sovereignty over it, is manifestly and gravely unlawful. It is an ongoing international wrong that must be brought to an immediate end. As the court ruled in 1971, quote, the continued presence of South Africa in Namibia being illegal, South Africa is under obligation to withdraw its administration from Namibia immediately and thus put an end to its occupation of the territory.
Eu fico imaginando qual é o tamanho da consciência política dessa gente e qual é o tamanho do coração solidário dessa gente, que não está vendo que na faixa de Gaza não está acontecendo uma guerra, mas um genocídio. De que não é uma guerra entre soldados e soldados, é uma guerra entre um exército altamente preparado e mulheres e crianças. Sabe o que está acontecendo na faixa de Gaza com o povo palestino? Não existe nenhum outro momento histórico. Aliás, existiu quando Hitler resolveu matar os judeus.
Şimdi Gazze'ye gideceğiz. Gençler, arkadaşlar, yiğitler, bacılarım, kardeşlerim, bizi yalnız bırakmayacağınıza inanıyorum. Gemiler alıyoruz, müjdeler olsun. Akdeniz'e gideceğiz, Gazze'ye gideceğiz. Yol açıktır, yol Filistin'dir.